This week we're going to be looking at empiricism, and we're going to be looking in particular at the theories of two very important thinkers in the history of empiricism, John Locke and David Hume. And the second part of this week is we're going to be looking at the theory of knowledge of Immanuel Kant. And Kant, as I mentioned last week, Kant wants to bring together the theories of empiricism and rationalism, and his construction of how those two theories can be conjoined is absolutely fundamental for understanding modern theories of knowledge. Everything is really divided into the theories that were proposed before Kant, including Descartes and Locke and Hume, and the theory of knowledge after Kant. And Kant's way of posing the problem really revolutionized the theory of knowledge and revolutionized the way of thinking about how the role of concepts and the role of sense experience works in our knowledge of the world. So we'll get to Kant subsequently. We're going to start by looking at empiricism, and we'll spend a bit of time talking about John Locke and David Hume in particular. Not so much Berkeley, who is the other thinker mentioned in this chapter. We're not really going to spend a lot of time thinking about him, but we will look at Locke and Hume. So, let's get started by looking at the three anchor points of empiricism as they are articulated in this chapter on empiricism. Now, for empiricists, the only source of genuine knowledge is sense experience. This means, and as we'll see, David Hume will talk about this, and he will argue that actually if we're empiricists, it means that we have to be skeptics about our knowledge, that our knowledge is incredibly limited. It does not really give us much to hang on to. It certainly doesn't give us universal truths. So, if the only genuine knowledge is sense experience, it suggests we have to be content with knowledge that's probable rather than certain. We can never know truths that are universal, and as we'll see, this is because all that sense experience gives us is knowledge that cannot be universalized to include every time and place, because quite simply we haven't experienced every time and place. So we can never say that something is always true, because of course, and Hume will talk about this, we can never be sure that experience in the future is going to be like experience in the past. We can never be sure that events that we haven't observed will be like events that we have observed. So we have to be content with probable rather than certain knowledge. Now, empiricists will also say that reason is an unreliable and inadequate route to knowledge unless grounded in sense experience. Every idea or concept that we have, according to the empiricists, is ultimately traced back to an original sense experience. So, for example, whereas we saw that for Plato, beauty is something that exists independently as a form, we have the form of beauty independently of any experience, and then we apply it to things that we see. For the empiricists, beauty is simply what we call the way that different sense experiences strike us, and sense experiences that strike us in sort of similar ways, affecting us in similar ways, having a similar effect on us, we call that effect beauty. So for empiricists, typically the idea of beauty is simply a matter of what a different set of experiences have in common, the common way that they affect us. So we trace back what that concept means to the experience that we have of these different objects, the common experience that we have of all of the objects that we call beautiful, for example, or good or whatever. The third thing empiricists claim is that there is no evidence of innate ideas within the mind apart from experience. Our minds at birth are like blank tablets. They do not contain anything unless and until we've sort of had experience of the world and we've filled them up with sensory experience. So we don't have, for example, mathematical knowledge or other sorts of knowledge that we're just waiting to apply to the things that we see. For empiricists, we don't have any knowledge until we've had sensory knowledge of the world. So these are the three things about empiricism. They would typically say that the knowledge that rationalists talk about, like mathematical knowledge and logical laws, either reduce to sense experience. In other words, we can reduce those truths to particular experiences that we've had in the world. In that case, of course, they become probable. If we can't reduce them, then empiricists will simply say they're not really cases of knowledge at all. They're empty. They're true by definition. And as we'll say, this is what, as we'll see, Hume's fork, what we're going to call Hume's fork, is all about. Hume argues that truths about the world, our knowledge, is either probable or it's true by definition, in which case it's empty. We'll get to that a little bit later. Now, of course, it sounds easy to say, and I think most of us, in my experience, most students are almost automatically empiricists. That is, we do tend to think that it makes sense to say that our knowledge comes from experience. We get our knowledge by using our senses. Now, that's easy enough to say. As Locke realized, however, it's a lot harder to actually figure out how we can make this idea work in an intelligible way. That is, how we can make that work as a theory of knowledge. And the first thing that we have to answer is, of course, what exactly is it that we get from our senses? What is the contribution that our senses provide to our knowledge? Now, Locke calls the original components that we get from our sense experience simple ideas. These are the simple things that, when we use our senses of sight, of hearing, of touch, our sense of smell, when we use our senses, these are the things that we get from using our senses, what Locke calls these simple ideas. For example, we can discriminate, using the sense of touch, objects as soft. Our sense of taste can discriminate bitter and sweet, and so on. We can distinguish cold and hot. And the sense of sight can distinguish, for example, different colors, yellow, brown, whatever. So there are different objects that we can distinguish, different qualities, and these are what Locke calls simple ideas. That's the contribution of sense experience. Now, Locke argues, in fact, that we construct more sophisticated concepts out of these simple ideas, and we do that by performing three very simple types of operations on them. In other words, we combine, or we get them together, we operate on them in different ways. Now, let's look at what these three different operations are. The first one is what he calls a compounding, or a joining together of two simple ideas. For example, from our perception, we have a simple idea of something yellow, right? We see a yellow patch in front of us. We then reach out and touch that object and find that it's smooth. We may find that it's sort of shaped in a sort of curved way. From those simple ideas, by joining together yellow and smooth, we arrive at the idea that we're dealing with a banana, that we have a banana. So the banana is a complex idea formed by joining together two or more relatively simple ideas, yellow and smooth. Now, of course, we can smell it as well, and a banana is going to have a characteristic smell. So there's going to be another sort of simple idea there as well. But that object, a banana, when we refer to it, we talk about it, that object is formed by compounding these different simple ideas. Yellow, smooth, distinctive smell. The object is a compound of those ideas. Now, the second way that we can sort of get more complex ideas, get what Locke calls, in fact, complex ideas, is by relating one simple idea to another. For instance, we can sort of place two people together and compare them in height. And this gives us the concepts of taller and shorter. So, by relating one idea to another, right, and developing relational terms between those ideas, for example, taller or shorter, rounder or thinner, we can develop ways of sophisticated ways of relating our objects. Now, the third way, according to Locke, is abstracting. And abstracting from a series of experiences gives us more general ideas. Here's our example. We see a number of furry, fur-legged creatures that say woof. We abstract the general idea dog, which is what those objects all have in common. Right? In other words, from the series of experiences we see, one dog, our neighbor's dog, we see our friend's dog, we see another dog. From the whole series of experiences of encountering dogs, we can abstract this general idea, which is what they all have in common. This general idea is dog, right? It's the idea dog. And that idea is a complex idea because it's formed from our experience of a series of separate individual experiences. That's what Locke means by abstracting. We get a general idea that is derived from a number of individual experiences. So compounding, relating, and abstracting are the three ways of developing complex ideas from our more simple. Now, Locke also believes that in order to get clear on whether we have genuine knowledge about the world, we have to distinguish what is objective, which means what is genuinely there in the world, and what is merely a part of our subjectivity. In other words, we have to leave aside the contribution that we make as subjects to what we see, what we hear, and so on. We have to leave aside what our subjectivity contributes in order to know what is really there, independent of the way things affect our senses. Now, the things that are there independently of us are formed of what Locke calls primary qualities. Those are the things that do not depend on the way things affect our senses. These are things like solidity, extension, shape, and motion. For Locke, they're part of scientific reality, and the world, independent of our senses, for Locke, is the world of scientific reality. It's the world as it is described by science. So it has these qualities. What it doesn't have is the world of what Locke calls secondary qualities. And these things are things like color, sound, taste, smell, and texture. They're not part of the object, but concern how it affects our sense organs. So, if we want to get clear on what is really there and what the world is really like, on knowledge of the world itself, we have to focus on the primary qualities. The secondary qualities give us knowledge about our world, about how our senses are affected by the primary qualities, by the things that are actually a part of scientific reality. Now, Locke and also Berkeley, who, like I said, we're not really going to spend time with, but Locke especially builds a theory of knowledge based on empiricism. Now, David Hume, who comes after Locke, he argues that when we think empiricism through, we inevitably end up in the standpoint of skepticism. And Hume argues that the only thing that we can get from sense experience is very tentative, probable knowledge. We certainly can't get anything near the idea of certain universal knowledge about the world. So, Hume argues that empiricism leads automatically to skepticism. And a big part of this is the very important principle that's called Hume's fork. Hume's fork establishes a very big gulf between reason, our ability to think and reason, and the world. And Hume's fork tells us that everything divides, and knowledge divides into two completely separate components. Either we have knowledge of the relations between our ideas. And by relations between our ideas, Hume means things about our thought, what is logically necessary in our thought. And this is different from what Hume calls matters of fact. And matters of fact are things which do tell us about the world, but they can never be certain. All that they can tell us is something happening in a particular time and place. but we can never have certain knowledge. So, for example, we may have knowledge that an event was sort of caused by another event in a certain time and place. Hume's example is we see a billiard ball strike another billiard ball and it appears to cause it to veer off in another direction. What we can't have knowledge of is the underlying metaphysical truth that every event is caused by other events. That is to say, for Hume, we cannot have the deeper certainties about the world that rationalism argues that we can have. All we can have are very specific claims which establish sort of, we argue for regularities, but we can never have the deeper underlying certainties. All our knowledge can ever be is probable. All our knowledge can ever be is probable because it's based on us having observed things regularly happening in the past. So it's never reaches the stage of certainty. That's why Hume argues that empiricism inevitably leads us to skepticism. So let's have a look at 3 areas where Hume plays out this. Now, in cause and effect, Hume argues that all of our judgments about causes and effects are based on the what he regards as the unjustifiable assumption that the future will be like the past. That is to say, we argue that because we've observed in the past that certain causes have certain effects, we extrapolate, we extend to the future and say, well, because this has always happened when I've done X in the past, that Y has happened, therefore when I do X now, Y is going to happen. Now, Hume argues that that's unjustifiable because, of course, we can never have knowledge. We can never be certain that the future will be like the past. We assume that it is because we live in a world where we like to have regularities and we trust in regularities, and we observe that, for example, the law of gravity always works and the sun always rises. So we live in a world of regularities, but what Hume is saying is that we can never justify the assumption that things that happened in the past will always be the case in the future, that causes and effects will always carry on from the past into the future. Now, remember the chicken. The idea here is that the chicken is a good example of how our thinking about the future can go wrong. Because the chicken expects every morning to get up and expects to be fed grain by the farmer. And indeed for many months, maybe even years, this is exactly what happens. The chicken gets up and is fed grain and lives very contentedly, as long as it's not a battery-bred chicken, of course. Otherwise lives very contentedly. Now one day, of course, the farmer comes along and cuts the chicken's head off and sells it to the market. Now, the chicken doesn't know this and has assumed that every day in the future will be like all days have been in the past, but one day this is not the case. So it's an illustration, but it's a little bit like that. This is called the principle behind this is the principle of induction, and it's the idea that we assume that what has held in the future, that causes, that effects have been produced by particular causes, will hold what's held in the past will hold in the future too. So the principle of induction extends from the past to the future. And Hume says that this principle, while it may have proved useful, can only give us probabilities. It cannot guarantee that the future will be like the past. So it doesn't give us certain knowledge. Now, just as the principle of cause and effect in metaphysical truths, Hume argues that this applies to the external world too. All we are ever aware of with Hume are what he calls our impressions. And these are contents internal to our experience, our impression of redness, of hardness, of coldness, etc. We have no way, he argues, of comparing our impressions with the external world. Everything that we might compare an impression with would be just another impression. So we cannot say anything about what lies outside of our experience. We cannot make any claims about what the external world is like because we can never we can never have anything except impressions to compare other impressions with. Thirdly, and Hume argues that the idea of a continuous existing self is also a myth. And he says this is wrong, and here he's disagreeing with Descartes, of course, who argues that we are sort of mental substances. Hume argues that all that we're aware of when we sort of think and reflect on ourselves is what he calls a bundle of impressions. In other words, we're a flow of psychological contents that is constantly changing. All that we observe is sort of like what Hume calls a theatre. It's the theatre of the mind where different perceptions and ideas pass successively away, make their appearance and repass and disappear. And I think intuitively we can sort of see what he's onto here, because a lot of the time, our thoughts seem to come to us from elsewhere, often without any degree of control on our part. And sometimes that of course, those thoughts are unwelcome and intrude upon us without us sort of wanting them there, so to speak. So I think we can be aware of what Hume is saying here, that there's a sort of flow of perceptions, of impressions, that's not necessarily held together by anything beyond them. That all that we are is just this theatre where different impressions come into the mind and then disappear. So he's really criticizing Descartes' idea that there is something substantial that persists through these changes, that there is some continuously existing self. Hume argues that's not true. All that there is this bundle of changing impressions. All that there is sort of the TV screen where different things are embedded and then disappear. So the third thing that Hume wants to criticize is the idea of a persisting self. Now, to really understand Kantian constructivism, which is Kant's contribution to epistemology, it's really important for us to bear in mind especially Hume's critique of empiricism. And what Kant is responding to more than anything else is Hume's critique of empiricism. Kant wants to argue against Hume that there is such a thing as genuine knowledge, but he also wants to argue against the rationalists, and as we'll see, that the way of combining rationalism and empiricism is really key to understanding Kant. He also wants to argue against the rationalists that we don't have knowledge independently of the contribution made by our sense experience. On the other hand, he does want to say that sense experience contributes to genuine knowledge. So Kant is going to combine these two ideas in a very unique sort of way, and we'll try and talk about that and get a sense of the overall plan of his epistemology. It's a very difficult and elaborate system, but I think if we can get an idea on how the combination of those two ideas is supposed to work, Kant's modification of rationalism and empiricism, then we'll be doing pretty well to get a sense of how Kantian constructivism combines these two things. Now, the question that Kant poses is this: how is universal and necessary knowledge possible? How is universal and necessary knowledge possible? The answer he gives us is, if we see reason as playing a role in constructing our knowledge. Okay? So not just sense experience, but reason as playing a role in constructing knowledge. And here is the key when Kant, on page 121 of the textbook, makes this claim. He says, "But though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience." So here's the thing: experience is necessary, but experience is not the sole source of knowledge, because there has to be a contribution from our reason as well, constructing our knowledge at the same time. So Kant is saying that experience must conform to the rational structure of our minds. Okay? So bear in mind that whereas Hume had said, because experience only gives us probable knowledge, it can only tell us that in a certain number of cases X has happened and X has been followed by Y, Kant is going to argue that we can say with certainty it is necessary that when X occurs, Y will happen. It is necessary that that will always be the case. Other things, of course, being equal. Because our mind organizes experience in certain necessary, predictable ways. And our mind organizes experience. One of the ways that it does that is by using the metaphysical principle of cause and effect. And it organizes everything that we see into effects and into causes. We couldn't have a world where that didn't take place. So, our experience has to conform to this rational structure. Therefore, there's a necessity to our experience. It's not just probable, it's not just, based on the luck of regularities, that things seem to sort of happen in regular ways, as Hume thought. It's not just based on habit and chance. Kant argues that it is a rational and necessary structure. So, here's then Kant's response to Hume. Hume argues that our experience cannot give us certainty and knowledge of universal laws such as every event has a cause, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, etc. This is what Kant says. We impose a universal and necessary structure on our experience by the way our minds organize the contents of experience. So, it's our minds and the way that they necessarily organize what we see that provides the universal and necessary structure. So, understanding the contribution of the mind is understanding the universality and necessity of our experience. However, we always have to bear in mind the two sides with Kant, that we're not simply going back to rationalism and say we're knowing things simply by thinking and using our reason. What Kant is saying is that it's only by the way that we organize sense experience that we can have knowledge. So, we have a contribution from our minds, which is the universal and sort of necessary structure, but that structure has to be imposed on a contribution to knowledge that comes from the senses. So, it's these two things working together. It's sense experience and it's our minds imposing that structure that gives us knowledge of the world. For example, let's just play this out a little bit more, the example that every event has a cause. Now, Hume is right, Kant argues, that we cannot establish with certainty that every event has a cause if we just rely on past experience. If we just say, for example, every time that X has happened, Y has happened in the past. However, we can establish it as certain if we see this idea as one of the ways that the mind filters and organizes experience. In other words, the relation of cause and effect is the way that our minds structure what we see. It's the way that our minds structure and make sense of our experience in the world around us. So that, when it starts to rain, we automatically structure that experience by looking for events that have caused that particular experience, that particular effect to happen. We look at weather systems and stuff like that. But whenever we see something happen, we structure it in terms of causes that brought that event about. Kant is saying that that's not something that we simply, it's not something that we find in the world that's simply there. Nor is it something that we simply deduce from having seen regularities happen in the past. Kant is saying that it's the way that our minds filter and organize what we see, that we impose the structure of cause and effect on our experience. Now, so the idea is that the way in which reality appears to us depends upon the contribution of both the senses and the mind or the intellect. This means that we have to distinguish between phenomena and noumena, and these are very sort of clumsy and old-sounding terms that Kant gives to these two ideas. Very simply, phenomena is simply the world as it appears to us, and all that this means is it's the world as it is constructed by our minds. The world as it is constructed by our minds. Noumena is simply the world of things in themselves, that is, things as they are outside of the world as it is constructed by our minds. So, for example, Remember that the law of cause and effect is one of the ways for Kant that our minds structure experience. That applies to the world of phenomena. Now, outside of that principle, what things are like in themselves, right, where that principle doesn't apply, that would be the world of noumena. Notice, however, that there's really nothing we can say about the world of things in themselves, the world of noumena. That we cannot make any statements about that world because we simply cannot know that world. All that we can know is the world of phenomena, the world as it is partly constructed by our minds. So, we can never know what things are like in themselves. That world is sort of permanently and perpetually off limits to us. We live in the world of phenomena. Same as for cause and effect holds for space and time according to Kant. These things, space and time, they're not somehow out there, they're not visible things that we see, they're part of the way that we structure and organize the world. So we put things in space. We put things next to one another, above other things, below other things. We organize things in time as before other things, after other things, succeeding one another, preceding one another. Kant argues that this is another way in which we structure and organize what we see. Could we imagine an experience in which there was no space and time? Kant would say no, that these are necessary for organizing experience. But could we imagine an experience in which space and time were organized differently? It may be that there are other beings who experience space and time differently than we do, who experience space and time in a completely different setting than we do, and don't have the same experience. Sensibility for Kant means our passive capacity to receive intuitions, and this is where Kant agrees in part with empiricism. That is, sensibility is the part of our apparatus that receives sense experience. Kant calls these things intuitions, that is to say, anything from sense experiences and intuition. It's anything present to the senses. The redness of a rose, the sweetness of a cookie, the hardness of a brick wall. These things are all things that are intuitions. Now, the understanding is the use of our minds to organize experience and apply categories to it that make it coherent. So whereas intuition is the sense experience part, understanding is the contribution of our minds to construct what it is that we see. And this is where Kant agrees in part with rationalism. An example of a category would be every event must be caused. Okay, so the law of cause and effect would be an example of a category. So there are many different categories for Kant. In fact, he distinguishes 12 main categories in his main book, The Critique of Pure Reason. And these are basically different ways of organizing our experience, different ways of setting out our experience into different groups and different categories. One very famous quote from Kant from the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason, and which I think says things very nicely, is this: thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. And the idea here is that our knowledge depends on, and it cannot function without, the joint contribution of two different things. We need sensible content provided by intuitions, and secondly, we need the organizing of our intuitions into coherent structures by the use of concepts. So sense experience by itself doesn't suffice, and our reason by itself and its sort of structures doesn't suffice either. We need both of them. We need the intuitions, and we need those intuitions to be organized by concepts. For example, for Kant, and again a little bit differently than the example we saw with Locke, and this is where Kant wants to do things differently. Our knowledge that there is a dog, our right to make the claim to knowledge, to know that there is a dog, depends for Kant on two things. And let's just spell out the two parts of knowledge here. Firstly, our intuitions, which remember are the contribution from sense experience. What intuitions do we have when we have a dog in front of us? Well, furriness possibly, maybe sound, it's panting, it's barking, maybe a distinctive smell, maybe a distinctive color, a distinctive shape. So there are different intuitions that strike us. However, that's not sufficient for us to be able to apply the concept dog and to be able to say there is a dog. Our concepts have to organize these intuitions into a coherent form. Furthermore, we need to organize those intuitions by using concepts like substance, unity, for it to enable us to say that here is one persisting object, this dog. That we have the concept of animalness, that a dog belongs to that species of things that we call animals. That it's four-legged, that it belongs to that category of things that we call four-legged creatures. So, not only do we need intuitions, we need to apply our concepts and categorize this sense experience by using our concepts to structure what it is that we see. And it's understanding how those two things work together, how those two things together produce knowledge, that is key for Kant to the idea of how we can have knowledge of the world. Well, there is some bad news as well, and that's that Kant's position does imply that we can never know reality as it is in itself. It's always filtered to us by the way our minds work. So there's a sort of pessimistic strand in Kant, a sort of under the surface melancholy, if you like, that we can never really know what things are like. We're always somehow confined in the reality that is structured by our minds. For example, even though we know that every event and experience will have a cause, we also know that this reflects the structure of our minds. It doesn't tell us anything about the world in itself, a world from which we're perpetually cut off by the structure of our experience. Some of Kant's most famous insights, we'll just talk about this very quickly to finish, are concerned with his idea of the limits to human reason. And these concern three areas in particular, and Kant distinguishes them as the self, the cosmos or the world as a whole, and God. And Kant famously said that part of what his epistemology was doing was limiting the scope of reason in order to make room for faith. Unlike the rationalists, Kant does not think that reason can provide us with knowledge about the most important things. That is to say, it can't provide us with knowledge of God, as Descartes, for example, thought that it could. Those things are forever outside our experience. In other words, we can't use our reason to understand those things. God, the world as a whole, the cosmos, or the self. They're outside of the world as it can be known by our experience. However, we can know that everything, and this is the good news, we can know that everything in our experience will conform to metaphysical, mathematical, and logical laws. We can know that there will be regularities, there's a necessary structure to our experience of the world. So there's a sort of there's a certainty in Kant, but we have to remember that certainty is also matched by a sense of the limitations of reason, of where our reason cannot take us. So Kant is very much aware of these limits and is aware that there are some things that reason cannot answer. And any possibility of tackling the question of God by using reason, by using thinking, Kant felt that was doomed never to succeed.